Welcome to FinOps in Action. I'm your host, Alon Arvatz. Each week, I'll sit down with FinOps experts to explore the toughest challenges between FinOps and engineering. This show is brought to you by Point 5, empowering teams to optimize cloud costs with deep detection and remediation tools that drive action. Hello, everyone, and welcome to FinOps in Action. Today, we have a very interesting guest with a very special perspective about FinOps. I'm actually really looking forward to this conversation. He's originally from Paraguay. His first job after school was a carpenter. He built Chick-fil-A's first cloud team, managing over 2,000 Kubernetes clusters, and today, he's principal consultant at CostOps.Cloud, Caleb Hurd. Happy to have you with us.
Thank you for the introduction, Alon.
Caleb, what should be the FinOps practitioner's top priority?
I think the top priority with a FinOps practitioner is a lot of people would dive into cost, right? A lot of people would give you lines around the typical FinOps missions, goals, chargebacks, show things to teams, observability. And those are important things. I don't want to diminish the importance of that, but I think a FinOps practitioner's goal is actually the same thing, the same goal as the VP of engineering or whoever's the top of R&D. And that is to balance the needs of customers using the system, right? You don't want to cut cost to the bone. I'm stealing that from something I've heard Doc Bill say. Engineers modifying the system, you have to have appropriate production environments. They have to be able to modify things easily. You want to pick technologies, not just that are inexpensive, but also that are easy to keep online and easy to modify. And then the third thing is shareholders. And that's where FinOps comes in. Shareholders are the ones that are pushing teams to do the first two things less expensively. So I think the FinOps practitioner's primary goal should be balancing the three of those, not necessarily hyper-focusing on cost. So some quarters you're going to be able to cut something. Some quarters you're going to need to be okay with that price increasing because you got to go satisfy one of those three customers.
So it sounds pretty intuitive what you're saying, but actually it takes the FinOps practitioner to a completely different place than the traditional places where he's at. Because traditionally, like you said, you're doing showbacks, chargebacks, you're focusing on reporting on the cost, and suddenly you're taking it to a place that is a lot more technical, because to balance performance and velocity of delivery and these type of things, you have to get very deep technically. Is that correct?
Yeah, I have a little bit of a hot take on this one. And
We love hot takes here, Caleb. Give it to us.
yeah, so again, that's the first step, right? Observe, like you can improve what you don't measure. So FinOps is really all about measuring today in its current form. And so I would say, yeah, sure. Step one is you roll out observability, you figure out your chargebacks, you get, good dashboards and good tracking, you get your forecasting down. You'd go tighten up your contracts, you do all the things that if you go buy a FinOps book, it's going to tell you to do. But that's really, once you pluck that 20% of savings in the low hanging fruit, the question is like, now what? And the truth of the matter is probably 50 to 60% of a bloated cloud bill is architectural choices that were made 2, 5, 10 years prior, right? And so here's my hot take. I think that the industry's gotten it wrong. I don't think FinOps should roll up to finance, and I don't think it should be predominantly financial people doing it. I think that FinOps practitioners should be engineers by trade who happen to delve in the FinOps. And there's a couple reasons for this. One, like I said, once you pick the 20% of the initial contractual low-hanging fruit, you really can't make progress on the meaty, difficult topics unless you have an engineering background. Number two, FinOps is probably 80 to 90% psychological. Like it is about influencing other humans to behave differently than they behaved before. And if there's anything I've learned about engineers, they will not listen to you. You cannot influence them unless they respect you, and they do not respect you unless you have technical chops. So I think FinOps practitioners frequently find themselves paralyzed or surprised when they are unable to influence these other humans to behave differently. And then lastly, you really, if you've lived the life and you've built and ran cloud environments, when you go to pick up an AWS bill and you read it, you can actually read the story of what's happening. Like it's almost, I hate to put it this way, but it's almost like somebody who's been through war experiencing PTSD is probably an extreme example, but it's like, I've been there. I know what that's like. I know the pain that's happening with the engineers today. I'm empathetic. I understand that they picked this kind of janky technology, but I've also been there, so I understand why. So your recommendations will be much more appropriate, much more surgical. You won't be recommending technology that is reasonable to you but crazy to them. You'll pick sort of middle of the road solutions. So I think there's a myriad of reasons why FinOps practitioners should be engineers first and finance second, but those are some of them.
That's very, very interesting. And I actually want to challenge what you say here.
Go for it.
So, sounds to me like you put a lot of focus on cost optimization and cost control. Some people will say, listen, cost optimization, that's not the most important goal of FinOps. The most important goal is to make sure that our cloud provides us the value we want to get and create the reporting that will allow management to make smart decisions around the cloud. What would you say about this claim?
I agree with the spirit of what you're saying. Obviously, you just repeated back to me in a much more succinct way what I just sort of went on a long tangent about, which is that, cost isn't the only thing that matters. So I agree with the pushback, but I think to push back to your pushback, if that's the case, right, if FinOps truly is not primarily about cost optimization, that's just a component of it, then why does FinOps roll up to the CFO? Like at the end of the day, FinOps engineers or FinOps practitioners and software developers and architects and DevOps and SRE engineers, they will prioritize whatever item shows up on their 12-month annual performance review at the end of the year. So, FinOps can put on their website, like, it's not just about cost, but if the FinOps practitioner is being judged on overall cloud spend for the year, and that's their primary annual performance review, it's all about cost. Doesn't really matter what the FinOps book says. And the same for DevOps and site reliability engineers. If they don't have cost as a component of what they're judged for annually, they're not going to prioritize cost savings. It's just not going to be a component of what they care about.
And I will add something on top of what you're saying, and that is, I think 90% of the FinOps team out there got the headcount and the budget based on how much money they're going to save with their optimization capabilities. So you can argue that maybe cost optimization is not the most strategic thing you can do as a FinOps person, and I can definitely relate to the business value conversations. Okay, I'm also there. I think that should be the scope. But at the end of the day, you cannot forget about cost optimization, cost reduction, because this is very often what promise the budget of your team and your department.
So what you're saying is, if my job was predicated on saving money and I don't save any money and my job goes away, that mysteriously is my highest priority?
More or less. I would say, I have to say, I don't think you can focus only on cost optimization, because cost optimization is something that you cannot predict. Sometimes you can do more, sometimes you can do less. So going to business value and making sure that the company can make informed decisions around the cloud, it's important, but don't forget about cost optimization. Never.
I think the rubber meets the road when an engineering team sits down and plans out their next upcoming sprint or series of sprints. Like, you can talk about security, you can talk about FinOps, you can talk about cost optimization, you can talk about AI, but it's the mixture of what they choose to prioritize over the next time horizon that's really where you find out what the business's priorities truly are, what the product team is allowing in, what the head of engineering is fighting for and allowing in. So I think these are interesting conversations, but that is sort of the funnel that gives you access to prioritize cost optimization or business value or, modernization or whatever it is that will benefit the company. That's where the rubber meets the road, in my opinion.
It sounds like you also talk a lot about how the industry should evolve, right? And you talk about it from the persona perspective and their background, maybe, or knowledge. I wonder if you also think that the industry should mature from looking at spend or cost to looking at efficiency.
I think if you want a trial by fire, you should carry a pager as a site reliability engineer. If you want to really, truly emotionally connect with how a system lives and breathes and grows and dies, if you get paged when that system goes down and you're the girl or you're the guy that's got to get it back online, um, you will truly appreciate optimizing that system, modifying it, launching it, upgrading it, maintaining it, securing it. The whole life cycle and bucket of a large scale application is really captured in the PagerDuty alert you get on your phone.
Got it.
I think so. I think it sounds silly, but I think FinOps practitioners should go and do a circuit, 3-6 month circuit in the engineering team. And I think they should go back after 2 or 4 years and go do it again and stay close to the problem.
That's an amazing tip. And Caleb, in the end of the day, I think that a lot of the FinOps practitioner out there that also listen to us, they don't have engineering background. Do you have any tips with them on how to engage with engineering people and how to do it right?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I know I've been a little doom and gloom on, you should already have an engineering background. I would say the best way I know it sounds silly, but go spend a couple of afternoons on engineering planning calls and listen in, PI planning or sprint planning or whatever they do, and flip your recording and transcript button on and go and talk to ChatGPT and learn every term, like understand conceptually every little term and nuance of the language in the conversation. And if you can sit through a technical planning meeting and follow along with no assistance, you're going to be light years ahead of most other practitioners. That would be sort of the down and dirty, you know, that's the back alley brawling technique. If you want the more nuanced boxer technique, I would say go get an AWS architect certification. There's various levels at various difficulty levels, but I would go and gobble them all up. I would go all the way with AWS certifications. And I'm not a huge certification fan. I'm not a huge fan of going and getting certs. In fact, actually, I don't even have them myself. But the reason that I recommend it in this case is 2 reasons. One, or GCP, and I specialize in AWS, but GCP, Azure, they all have similar programs. One, they do a really good job of telling you about the 5 different tools that solve the same problem and introducing you to the pros and cons of those 5 different tools. Number 2, you'll learn cloud native solutions, and they almost always are superior to third-party solutions you bring on board, and they're cheaper. And number 3, the industry still tends to respect and recognize these certs. So
These are very, very good practical tips on how to get up to speed with engineers. Thank you for that. And Kelly, I want to take you to the beginning of the conversation. So you talked a bit about the balancing cost with other aspects. And I think that many of the FinOps people out there, they have a lot of recommendations for cost optimizations, ways to make their infrastructure more efficient. How would you go about with prioritizing all these different recommendations?
one of the things I do when I'm dealing with a new application, a new team, a new group of engineers is I'll run an exercise. Well, I'll fire up a Miro board and I'll make 4 columns t-shirt sized small, medium, large, extra large. And those columns represent effort. And then the y-axis basically ranks those columns based on cost savings. So if you add a card to that board that's going to save $100,000 a month, and you add another one that's $50,000 a month, then the 100,000 will rank higher. And then I color code the cards dark to light based on risk. So if you have like a small change, but it's like massively risky, I want it to stand out that that particular change is a very risky change. If you have a very unrisky change, let's say cleaning up non-production like dev or test, then I want that to be light and apparent. And I get these engineers in there. I don't let them talk to each other. And I run a session where they just throw up every idea they've ever had about cost savings. And of course, I have my Rolodex of stuff that I already know I'm going to bring to the table. So I put that in there too. And then we group similar ideas because it's about volume, right? They like crowd everything in the Excel column because they're engineers, and in the face of uncertainty, engineers will always, pick a very long horizon on doing work, which is great. But then at the end of that exercise, once we've brought a few things back from Excel after we've debated them and we've ranked everything, I will draw a line starting from the lower left up to the upper right. And that line will allow me to capture maybe a few XLs, maybe a third of the larges, maybe half of the mediums, and most all of the smalls. And that line that I draw, that is the next year's worth of work above it. And below that line is next year or the year after's idea board to maybe go back to the drawing board and think about. And that's a hugely, hugely useful exercise because the most productive thing I can do is to not do work that shouldn't be done. And I cannot even begin to tell you how many times people have pursued work that didn't save a lot of money, but it was kind of a cool tool or was neat. Or the other thing that I'll go back and I'll mix in is switching costs, because one of the silent killers is the people cost. That tends to be this nebulous thing that nobody tends to count. So it's like, okay, we might save $20,000 a year with this database technology, but now I'm going to have to cough up $100,000 in 6 months of an engineer's time to go do the migration. Like that, it stops to make sense after a while, right?
Yes, totally makes sense. And I also like the methodology of effort, risk, and potential savings. I wonder if when you calculate the potential savings, you also take into considerations that there are savings that might be small, but can be handled in bulk. So you can take care of a lot of small ones together. And I wonder if that's something that you also take into consideration when you build your model.
Yeah, no, it's a really great question. Usually, I'm almost always pick up all the smalls. Like rarely, if an engineer team throws 30 ideas into the small category, it's pretty rare that it doesn't make sense to go tackle those. So I do find that we get a pretty good volume of sort of hey, if I went and deleted this one S3 bucket, it would save us a bunch of money. Like that's awesome. But if it's a resource that you get to touch more than 100 times or more than 500 times, then it needs to be bumped to medium, and you need to write a script. You need to do something programmatic to clean it up and enforce it, because clearly it's a issue that's going to arise again, right?
Cool. And Caleb, you moved from being a practitioner to being a consultant. How is it different?
Yeah, so I actually never did FinOps solely, right? So I've been working in cloud for a long time, and I've been responsible for keeping systems running, building them out, migrating them, updating them from a leadership perspective and from a technical perspective. And it's a lot of work. It's a lot of 3 a.m. phone calls. It's a lot of after hours, pressure. And I have this tendency to go find environments that need to be updated, that need to be migrated, which is even more effort. So in December, I took a step back and asked myself, like, out of my job responsibilities, what do I really enjoy doing? And out of all the responsibilities I've had in the past, the the one thing I never got a 3 a.m. phone call about, the one thing was FinOps and savings. I've never had an executive call me at 3 in the morning and be like, "Hey, why is this report wrong?" So I've only been doing FinOps consulting in a focused way for about 3 months now. And I think the biggest difference between consulting or being a FinOps practitioner, because I think they relate to this too, is that I can no longer just make a decision. I can no longer listen to people's, back and forth reasoning and then say, okay, I've heard both sides. This is what we're going to do. Like there's no decisiveness in what I do. I am now in a position where it's pure influence. You know, it's a lot like the difference between raising toddlers that you have to sort of order around, otherwise they'll run into the street, and raising teenagers where you're sort of softly suggesting like maybe you shouldn't do that.
Nice. And we also got some parenting advice along the way.
That's right. Yeah. Don't let your kid run into the street. There you go. There's some free advice.
Exactly. And I can definitely relate to what you're talking about because I come from a security background. Whoever listens to this podcast knows that because I talk about it a lot. And in security, every weekend you're being called every weekend. And it's also because, it's always your luck to get things on the weekend. But also attackers really operate more on weekends when people are off guard. So every weekend we had a call, and now with FinOps, I have less calls on weekends. So that's
There you go.
that's definitely a benefit. That's definitely a benefit. And and Caleb, as a consultant, and obviously you have a very different take on the industry and very unique perspective and point of view. How do you go about now? You enter an organization. What are the first questions you ask? What are the first thing you do? How do you go about it?
So I already described sort of the brainstorm session, which so much gets extracted in that process. But I don't really think there's any like one size fits all recommendation on going into an environment. I think I think it's actually more about a person's character and their makeup as a human. You just have to be really curious and not accusatory. And because when you look at the bill, you're going to draw certain conclusions. And then you're going to go talk to management and they're going to be like, oh yeah, we've been wanting to get off that database technology forever. And then you're going to go to, the engineer, you're going to go to the manager of the team and they're going to be like, oh, we've been wanting to get off of it, but we just have never had time. And then you're going to go to the engineer themselves and they're going to be like, are you crazy? This database technology is the only thing that can handle this one esoteric call that is so massive. I've hit this before. It was like some Oracle call that was not performant on any other technology in existence. And so literally they were like, just leave it running. Don't ever touch it. Right. And you wouldn't find this out until you went all the way down and you talked to the engineer that was actually maintaining it. So, and the opposite can be true. I've talked to engineers that are like, yeah, well, we do a hot DR backup because management said so. And then you talk to management and you realize that, the CTO changed out 3 years ago and that initiative no longer applies. And so there's a lot of like curiosity that has to emerge. Not being accusatory, being very interested and curious and questioning, but you got to balance that with a backbone where you're okay going against the grain and making suggestions that people don't necessarily want to hear, because you're also dealing with humans that are dealing with sunk cost fallacy. They're worried about you calling their baby ugly. Sometimes it is your job to tell them that their baby's not going to win a pageant. It's okay. Like, you don't have to call their baby ugly. You just can say they're not a gap baby. Um, so yeah, just asking a lot of questions, getting to know the architecture, looking at the bill, reconciling those two things.
And do you feel that the fact that you come from outside allows you to be a lot more unbiased in comparison to actually being a practitioner that is being measured on everything?
In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. In some ways, it makes me less biased because the savings are what they are. It's like if I look at an environment and there's no savings to be had without massive risk, then that's the answer, right? I don't have to feel a pressure to walk away with a certain number. Whereas practitioners that are full-time employees, they're hired and they're told like save $1 million, and they're like, well, we only spend 900,000. So how am I going to do that? Um, but in other ways, I think I'm more biased because when it comes to solving these problems, I tend to want to use solutions that I've used in the past. And solutions I've used in the past this stuff ages out quickly. So staying current is very difficult. So in some ways, I don't, I had to work really hard to try to bring the best solutions to the table and not just reuse what I did 5 years ago. Right.
Absolutely. Thank you for all the practical advice, Caleb. Very, very practical. So we already learned a lot from you. I think it's time to learn more about you. So today you live in Atlanta, Georgia.
Yep. I've been in Atlanta for, 17, 18 years now. Been a while.
Yeah. Where did you live before?
When I moved to the US from Paraguay, I moved to a place called Blairsville, which is 2 hours north of Atlanta, and worked on my granddad's farm. And then, as you said, became a carpenter actually at 16, my first job. Actually I dropped out of high school. It's a long story, but it definitely was not a traditional path into technology. I didn't even get a bachelor's until I was like 25 or 26, something like that. Currently working on my master's, but not even because I need it, so much as I just find that topics that they cover in that degree are very interesting to me. So, yeah, so anybody that's like, I'm a carpenter and I'm listening to this call, let me tell you, there is a path into technology from any industry.
Absolutely. And can you share with us maybe a book or a movie that you'd recommend?
I don't do as much personal reading as I should, but on the professional side, I've got this book, Crucial Conversations. So I have several books on resolving conflict. I think conflict is probably one of the core items that arises in software development, or really any delivery of a thing that involves many humans. And so that's a really, really good one on resolving conflict. And then there's another book behind me called The Manager's Path. And even if you don't go into technology management, it does a really good job of breaking down what software engineers should be doing, what managers should be doing. If you're a FinOps practitioner and you're like, how does this all fit together? Like, how does a team function, or should function in a healthy way? The Manager's Path will tell you the different breakouts of those roles in technology. And then the last one I'll recommend is Team Topologies. It gets into something called Conway's Law, which I think is absolutely one of the most critical concepts in technology. A lot of time, like the Conway's Law is however you organize the teams is the patterns that the software will emerge by. And I think it's from like the 70s or 80s or something like that. And the way that Conway stated it is, if you ask me to give you a compiler and I organize 3 teams, it will become a 3-part compiler. Right? Because that's how you organize the teams is how the architecture will emerge. And this is actually Conway's Law is one of, I'm not very original. I'm stealing Conway's Law. And I talk about how I disagree with how FinOps is organized, because the way that the org chart looks directs FinOps towards just one of the 3 sort of pillars of cloud. So there you go.
And this one definitely goes into my bucket list of books I have to read. Thanks for the recommendation. And now, Caleb, that you don't have a pager duty and no one is calling you at 3 a.m., what do you do after work?
So I definitely am an addict to hobbies. I have so many hobbies. coffee, and you can see some things behind me, collecting Air Jordan 1s, 3D printing. I'm currently working on a Jeep right now. So I have, coffee and all sorts of hobbies, but I think the one that I probably enjoy the most is hiking. So I'm currently section hiking the Appalachian Trail. I'm doing it sort of one section at a time. Definitely slow progress. I'm only about 10% of the way, through it right now. But that's definitely my most enjoyable hobby, is going out, getting out of cell phone range, totally unplugging from the world and just being out in nature, doing something difficult. I thoroughly enjoy it.
And I definitely should do it more as well. Disconnecting from my phone.
I hear you. It's not easy. But it's very worth it.
Cool. And if any one of our listeners would like to reach out to you, the best way is LinkedIn.
Yeah, hit me up on LinkedIn. My website also is CostOps.Cloud. But yeah, if anybody wants to reach out and talk to me and ask advice, I mean, I do this for a living, but I actually really enjoy it and I'm pretty passionate about it. So if anybody's listening and they want to break into FinOps, or they are a FinOps practitioner that wants to go the technical route, I'm happy to give advice. And, I love helping people. So
that's great. Guys, CostOps.Cloud and on LinkedIn, highly recommended. Caleb, thank you so much for joining us today. And I would also like to thank our audience for joining us once more. If you learned something important today, and I'm sure you did because we had a lot of practical advice today, or if you just had a lot of fun, please tell your friends about the podcast. Caleb, thank you again. This has been another amazing, fascinating episode of FinOps in Action. See you next time. That wraps up another episode of FinOps in Action. Thank you for joining. For show notes and more, please visit FinOpsInAction.com. This show is brought to you by Point 5, empowering teams to optimize cloud costs with deep detection and remediation tools that drive action.